Okay, that's come back. Recording's happening. So, Michael, maybe we could start with plant thinking, which is a wonderful idea. But can you explain what's plant thinking?
Certainly, yes. So when we conceptualize thinking, we usually have abstract ideas in mind, concepts, and so on. And it seems that thinking bestows a unique kind of privilege on a human being because only humans can operate with these abstract concepts and categories. And even then, presumably not all humans. So there is a kind of discriminatory gist in this defining of what is a human based on this very restricted capacity for thinking. My intention with coining this term, plant thinking, was to broaden the scope of what we think about when we say thinking, not only toward animals, but also toward plants, and to basically get back to a key insight of ancient ontology, of ancient Greek thought, where thinking and being belong together. So that a certain mode of being, which would be vegetal or a plant mode of being, would be also coterminous with or would coincide with the vegetal or plant mode of thinking. And so my task, the task that I saw before me was to utilize all the philosophical and not only philosophical resources at my disposal, from phenomenology to contemporary European philosophy, but also cutting edge plant science that recognizes a certain plant intelligence as well, and the work of some of the leading artists in the world, to put all of that together in order to get a glimpse of what plant thinking might mean. Obviously, plants do not have neuronal structures. They do not have a central nervous system or a brain, but that doesn't mean that they are not thinking, precisely because thinking as a kind of openness to the world, an openness that allows a being to be affected by and to respond to selectively respond to certain things from the world, can happen outside of the central nervous system, and does happen outside of our brain as well. So that in contemporary Western philosophy, psychology, and so on, there is the notion that we think not only with our heads, but the kind of the whole body is involved in the thinking capacity, even in the case of human beings. So that our very often it would be a kind of an unconscious thinking, whereby certain bodily position and changes in the body positions would also reflect this thinking of the body itself outside the purview of the brain and the central nervous system. And so the idea was to see how plants open themselves up to the world, respond to the world selectively, make certain decisions and choices, and interact with a whole variety of creatures, from fungi and bacteria in the ground to insects above ground level and so on. And are thinking in every bit of their bodily extension, through their leaves and flowers, through their branches, through the roots as well. And once again, there I align the insights of contemporary phenomenology that considers consciousness or thinking to be a directedness toward the other, a directedness toward the world. And plants are wonderfully directed in all kinds of ways, not only to the sunlight, but also to the moisture and mineral resources below ground and so on. So to align those insights of phenomenology, consciousness as a directedness toward something, with the insights from contemporary plant science that equates, for instance, the behavior of roots below ground to the behavior of animals in a labyrinth that seek the most efficient way to get to the resources that are hidden in this labyrinthine kind of structure, and with the work of certain artists who are allowing for the fact that plants are not only objects to be represented, but subjects in their own right, with the world of their own, and to align all of those resources at our disposal, and from that to start coming up with the image of what is called plant thinking.
Now, because you not only challenge and encourage us to recognize that how plants flourish and grow is like there's thinking involved in a sense of that at that term. But you also say, you seem to be suggesting that there are things we can learn from this kind of thinking. I'm thinking of a quote in your article, I think it was "To Share Without Dividing," where you say a tree whose roots are both flexible and tenacious may be in the best position to teach us a lesson about the ecology to come. So it's not just that it exists, but there's things for us to learn from plant thinking.
Yes, certainly. This has been my point for a number of years now, and I tend to call it not only learning from plants, but a kind of cross-species, cross-kingdoms pedagogy, so that we can learn from other than human beings, including obviously plants. And the reason why we can learn from them is because we have misjudged the gulf that separates us from plants, from a certain vegetal tendency of existence. We tend to operate with systems of classification where plants belong to a certain biological kingdoms and animals, and including Homo sapiens belong to another kingdom. But in fact, if we allow for the idea that this kind of unconscious mode of thinking, embodied mode of thinking, is also present in us, that we humans think not only with our brains, but with our whole body, and very often unconsciously so, then there is something vegetal in us as well, which is precisely what psychoanalysis, for instance, called the unconscious. And so the idea would be not only to learn from plants that are outside of us as this type of living beings, but also to acknowledge a certain repressed tendency, vegetal tendency within human existence, the plant in us, as it were, right? So I recognize this existence of plants outside of me as subjects in their own right, with a world of their own, but also the existence of a vegetality in me, of this inner plant that has been repressed and suppressed throughout millennia of Western philosophy, precisely because it was not proper to what was conceived of as being human, as being the self-directed, conscious, and purely rational being. Right. So, in that sense, learning from plants entails recognizing both of these types of vegetality, external and internal.
And leading to, in terms of the current crisis in climate and the environment, but leading to more of a sense of connectedness, leading to a recognition that we don't kind of float in our heads up here, not unconnected to the world. Is that the benefit that we can get from this in this moment of crisis?
Yes, I think this is the gentle way of putting this benefit. A harsher way in which we have been brought back to our senses in terms of not being these disembodied individuals who are not rooted anywhere is the COVID-19 situation. Because all of a sudden, those parts of the global human population that have been very mobile and have been moving across country boundaries and between continents and so on, have realized that there are other uninvited guests who can catch a ride, either in our bodies or in the actual means of transport, meaning the viruses, right? And I think that this has been also, in a sense, a vegetal lesson, but of a harsher variety, as I mentioned, in the COVID-19 situation, when whole countries were under strict lockdown. All of a sudden, the sense of being sedentary or sessile was fleshed out for us in a very stark way. And we became almost literally plant-like, either being inside our own houses or inside the neighborhoods which we could not leave, but at the same time sending these kinds of ethereal roots and shoots through the social media, through the internet, and through all the technological connections that we have. So meaning that being in place physically for a human being does not mean that we are stuck and stagnated, but in fact there can be an intense kind of travel even while we are in place. So there's a kind of reconfiguration of vegetality, of vegetal being in human technologies, particularly through the internet, and this kind of rooting out and branching out that makes us collectively plant-like, even in these high-tech conditions.
Michael, I mean, you comment on a wide range of things. We're focusing on just a couple of things that you comment on, everything from Slavoj Žižek to politics in the former Soviet Union. I mean, you write about a whole range of things. But one of the things you write about, and I think it is intimately connected to what we're just talking about now in terms of our roots and our connectedness, is work you've done on what you call dump philosophy, which, unlike plant thinking, which seems to kind of open one's mind and make one think of flourishing and expanding, is really, I have to say, I read the article that is a bit of a foretaste of a book you're publishing later this year. It's pretty depressing stuff. Maybe we can now talk a little bit about dump philosophy and what that is and what you have determined constitutes basically almost everything in our lives.
Yes, thank you for this question. In very simple terms, I should probably preface this by saying that rather controversial German philosopher Martin Heidegger thought that every epoch, every historical epoch has its name or misnomer for being, for what being is. So that for Plato, being meant ideas, and for Aristotle it was the unmoved mover. In medieval philosophy, the name for being was God. It was also substance in Leibniz and Spinoza. Being was named subject in the modern philosophy of Descartes and Kant, and so on and so forth. And my suggestion is that in our current epoch, the name for being is dump, both as a verb and as a noun, because what is happening is that every single register of being is being scrambled precisely through the activity of the dump that I describe in this book. And what is that activity? The activity is a kind of massive outpouring of non-differentiated and indifferent parts of existence, shredded, mingled, and so on. And I can give you just a few pointers. So it could be sound bites and remnants of old metaphysical dreams and ideas of eternal life and sort of existence that simply does not come to an end. It could be just a mass of information that falls on us and plasters us. It is also the mass of toxins that are being released into the environment. And even more so now in the COVID-19 situation, when some people have been celebrating the positive effects of the shutdown for the environment, but in fact, there has been this neglected underside of the whole situation when the mass of disinfectant and other kind of toxic substances that has been released into the environment grew exponentially, not to mention all kinds of non-decomposable parts of personal protective equipment. So all of that mixed with certain things that are particularly detrimental to the environment, things that do not decompose, do not rot, such as plastics that simply break down into smaller and smaller pieces until finally decomposing after 500 or 600 years, or spent nuclear materials, depleted uranium, that takes almost an eternity to really decompose compared to a human lifetime. So all of that together constitutes, these are not random things or artifacts. To my mind, this constitutes the activity of a dump, this massive outpouring of indifferent and non-differentiated aspects of things that are psychological, interpersonal, physical and physiological, philosophical, and you name it. All levels of existence are scrambled and mixed in this kind of dumping. Yeah.
And and it's us. It's not a dump out there that we're living on top of, as you point out. It it's in us. It is us. I mean, we have become a dump.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And that's where we're returning to the definition of thinking that we started with. So if we take very seriously this modern critique of traditional philosophy where the body is separated from the mind, and if we say the body is really integrated with the mind, it's a mind-body unit that we're talking about. In that case, all of this kind of mental garbage information that plasters us has to be reflected at the level of bodily existence. And all of the junk food and toxins that we ingest and inhale and otherwise bodily include in ourselves has to be reflected at the level of thinking as well, at the level of the mind. And if furthermore we take seriously the fact that this mind-body unit is not separate from its environment, but in fact is mutually constituted or co-constituted with its environment, then whatever happens in the environment, whatever poisons or toxins are released into it, cannot help but affect this mind-body unit whose environment it is. So if these traditional boundaries dissipate and become much more porous, which is something that has been argued about for decades already and has been supported for decades, if we take it seriously, then we have to acknowledge that all of this dumping of toxins into the environment is also a poisoning of ourselves at all levels of existence, mental or physiological.
Because if you left it just at dump, I guess I could imagine, okay, well, that's the ground in which I am going to grow, and but you link the image of dump really closely to desert. So your view is that where we're going with this is not just the expanding dump, but along with the expanding dump is an expanding desert.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I see both of these occurrences or both of these phenomena happening at the same time, so that there is a certain clutter of mental life, of social life, of physiology, of the environment, a clutter with things that once again would not decompose, would not pass away, or would, in passing away, would take with them an untold number of lives, human or not. So this is what is happening at the level of the dump. The desert that is being created is, in a sense, an effect of the dump itself. It is a kind of devastation, the rendering or devastation of existence, rendering existence too vast to be lived, to really accommodate a finite life or lives. And so I see this as a kind of double effect. So the desert and the dump are a double effect of the devastation of these very precise and very fragile and relatively narrow confines, enabling confines for existence. Once those confines are devastated, are done away with, we end up with these extremes of the vastness of the desert that is just empty and is emptying out all of this richness of life, the biodiversity that is passing away, and the clutter of the dump at the same time that is suffocating existence with its too much of stuff that simply would not decompose, would not rot, would not pass away.
Okay, I'm dragged way down again. This is depressing stuff. But Michael, I'm glad to learn from our conversation today. I mean, I had read this and I thought it was in a different order, but that you didn't. That's not where you've ended up in some ways. I mean, the analysis you still hold you hold to be true, and to me, it feels right. You know, like microplastics, everything from microplastics to what am I supposed to believe about St. Thomas Aquinas, you know, like it just seems like microplastics, pollution, dump. But you've found some sources and you've written about it pretty extensively and I think really beautifully in like the article about The Verge from a source which in some ways was a bit surprising. Hildegard. Here's somebody who's kind of a Heideggerian scholar and talking about dumps and ontologies of plant thinking. I mean, and suddenly we have this sort of, I'll use the term, flowering of investigation into Hildegard von Bingen, the medieval thinker, writer, mystic, musician. She seemed to do everything. Saint. You found something there that really creates for you a sense of life.
Yes, yes, I found something that creates a sense of life and that really resonates very closely with my concerns with regard to the history of Western philosophy. Because ever since I published my first book on plant philosophy, plant thinking, my attempt was to vegetalize the Western philosophical canon, to bring it face to face with its disavowed, repressed other, which is a plant. Because if for a philosopher, starting with Plato, true being is that which does not change, that which is not generated, that which does not pass away, that is ever simply the same, then true being, which for Plato is ideas, is the exact opposite of a plant, which is defined by its constant generation and self-regeneration and growing and metamorphosing and decaying and so on. So ever since Plato, the plant is this disavowed, repressed other of philosophy. And I think that Hildegard is accomplishing the same gesture with regard to the theological tradition, the Judeo-Christian theological canon, where she is in very creative ways vegetalizing the key figures in this canon, from the Holy Spirit to Christ and Mary and the saints. She is lending them certain vegetal figurations and equating them to certain parts of plants, and making this theological tradition itself a living one, one that can change and grow and perhaps even decay, giving birth and giving space to a new life, a new kind of system of beliefs and way of thinking and so on, which is what is really sorely needed, both at the level of cogitation, belief, and so on, but also at the level of actual existence. And I think that I turned to Hildegard precisely at the height of despair, having finished writing this book of dumb philosophy and thinking, so what can we do with this dump that is also ourselves? How can we resist it? And one of the ideas in dump philosophy is development of the concept of biomass, because I argue that all life in the age of the dump is transformed into biomass, which is this kind of complex two-way flow of bio or bios, which is the Greek for life, into mass, the massification of life, but also it's becoming heavy. It's measuring simply by weight, and therefore homogeneous with regard to quality, right? On the one hand, there is a flow of bios or life into mass. On the other hand, there is a transformation of mass of weight into life, right? And I try to argue also that instead of thinking about biomass as being over there, over and against us, and us being exempt from it, we should really identify with life as biomass and see what can be done within this kind of identification, within this sort of solidarity. And from there, this idea of mass has really captured my imagination, because the new book on Hildegard is titled Green Mass, the Ecological Theology of St. Hildegard of Bingen, precisely because, at least in English, this wordplay works. Mass can mean this heaviness, the weight of a thing, as in biomass, but it is also liturgical church service. So it is a word that combines in a wonderful way the most material, the most concrete sense with the most spiritual and the highest. And to my mind, this is what Hildegard is doing throughout her writings and throughout her theology, where she's giving the most spiritual of senses to the most mundane of phenomena, and vice versa, is giving a mundane twist, a twist of finite existence to the highest spiritual realities.
And because you work through a whole set of images that and language that she uses, because she was a poet and was very creative in her use of language, but repeatedly it's this image of a green shoot. It's not like like Mary herself is this green shoot, that Jesus is like a green shoot. It's not sort of like a fruit that is then offered up to people, but it's always this kind of fresh potential that
Yes.
focuses
Yes,
on.
absolutely. For me, this is very important, and I think this is not accidental that Hildegard is drawing these analogies between Mary and Jesus, and the greenest branch, who is Mary, and a beautiful, brilliant flower, who is Jesus in her writings. So Mary becomes a kind of carrier of Jesus. She carries him not as a fruit carries a seed precisely, but as a branch hoists and uplifts its flower. And this rejection of the fruit, or this shunning away of the fruit that you mentioned, is very important in my exegesis, in my interpretation of Hildegard, precisely because I think that she sees the promise of Christianity in this kind of self-refreshing movement of, of thinking and relating to the world, that does not find a closure, that does not find its kind of rounding off as in the fruit, that does not attain a telos or the highest end with what is happening, but that is constantly reconfiguring and reimagining and reshaping itself precisely as a growing plant, as a branch, a shoot, and the flower on it. And so this, I call it the essential immaturity of life itself and of the theological canon that is digitalized by Hildegard. We tend to think of immaturity as something bad. We'd say, grow up, become an adult, be mature finally, don't be a child. But Hildegard finds in this kind of childishness, this playful childishness that constantly reinvents itself and that refuses this closure of mature adulthood, the way of salvation, really. The way of salvation that is tied to the fate of this world here below, that does not seek this immutable reality outside of the world, but rather puts its trust in what Hildegard calls viriditas. This is her main concept, viriditas, which means it can be translated in various ways from the Latin, but I like to translate it as the greening green. That is the green color, but also the activity of greening, of making or rendering green. So that this and viriditas for Hildegard is the capacity of creation to refresh itself, to recreate itself after this initial impetus given to it by God in the first act of creation. And this is what interests her the most. It is this self-refreshing capacity of creation that embodies something of the first divine gesture, but within the finitude of this life here below. And she sees it most clearly embodied in the life of plants, but obviously also shared by all forms of life. And that is why she imbues the key figures in the Christian canon, Mary and Jesus, precisely with this greenness as opposed to the ripeness and the maturity of a fruit.
Michael, you are a modern secular academic. I don't think you're Catholic, from what I could glean from your writings and your background. Uh, what does a medieval Catholic perspective on things, and Mary as a green branch, I mean, how does that speak to us? What are modern secular people who may probably aren't believers? I mean, I happen to be, but most people we're working with aren't. What do you how are you inspired by that? What do we take from it? How can it help others who are not Catholic and not medieval make sense of this dump and desert we're trying to make our way through?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I think that there is a direct connection here between looking at both at the philosophical and the theological sources of today's environmental crisis, because the global environmental crisis that we're living through is not an accidental event, a singular accidental event in the history of humanity. There have been precedents prepared for it at the level of intellection, at the level of cognition for centuries, if not for millennia. I mentioned Plato and this dream, this obsession with immutable being, which we now see perversely realized in these materials that would not rot, that would not go away, and therefore are taking away the capacity of life precisely to reinvent itself. So these old dreams of the metaphysical tradition have been realized, but realized as the absolute nightmare from the environmental point of view, from the environmental perspective. But philosophy is not the only culprit here. I think theology is another culprit. And yet Hildegard, for me, represents this heterodox tradition in Judeo-Christian theology, one that is really attentive toward, as I mentioned, the life here below, toward the vegetal world, one who is not obsessed about these immutable realities, but who is trying to detect traces and sparks of that, of something divine in the mundane things of this world, such as plants. And so, to my mind, this is a kind of fork in the road. My question is, what if the Western philosophical and theological tradition were to follow the path of Hildegard and not the path of Plato and Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, for instance? Would we perhaps not be experiencing this current environmental crisis that is obviously brought about by certain economic forces, but the grounds for which have been prepared by the theological and philosophical ideas that have become dominant in the West? So I see in Hildegard this kind of promise within the tradition to seek another direction. And I think we desperately need this at this point in time.
You've been really generous with your time. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. When we get this kind of pulled together and posted, I'll send you a note with a link to it. But
yes.
I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope we can connect again at some point. I'm looking forward to the books. I'll be reading both of them now. But it's just wild stuff. It's fun stuff. It's depressing stuff. It's inspiring stuff. Good on you for your work. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Roel. I've also really enjoyed the conversation. So if you need anything else, please let me know, and we can talk again another time. Yeah.
Well, and we're looking at maybe doing a couple of online conferences in the fall now that those sorts of things have moved on. This will be much more with people who are kind of involved in the project, so a little bit more practical potentially. I don't know, but I'm certainly, you're on my short list of candidates for one of those sessions too. So thank you again, Michael.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Roel. Okay, bye. Have a nice day.